Now what we are going to do is give the user or a user the ability to sign in to their account. We've already allowed a user to register, which generated a hash for their password and a salt value, and we can now utilize them to allow them to actually sign in, set a session to signify that they're signed in, and then in another part we're going to look at actually the remember me functionality, so the ability to remember this user. So the first thing that really we want to do is outline the form that we're going to create, which is going to allow them to enter the credentials they need to sign in. So we have an action and a method here. The method's going to be post, and the action is just going to be blank, so we submit back to this page. Now we're going to do similar. We're going to create similar markup to that we did for the registration. So we're going to have a label for a particular field or a particular ID. This is going to be for username. We'll just end that label field, and we'll say username, and we will create an input field, and we'll be validating these as well. So an ID of username, and we'll set autocomplete so off as well, so we don't get a long list of values. So that's the username, and we'll also obviously need to give the ability to supply the password. So let's just go ahead and change these field names or these attribute values. Okay, so we're obviously going to need a login button. So it'll just be a submit button with the value of login. And additionally, we've already looked at token generation for cross-site request forgery. It's not massively important to include it here, but let's go ahead and do this anyway. Just set a token. Just makes it a lot more consistent. So the value here is basically just going to be echo token generate, so we can generate a token there. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we'll open and close PHP tags at the top so we can perform a variety of checks. Obviously the first thing that we need to do is require in the initialization file that we've already created and we already know. The first thing to do then is check whether input actually exists or not, so whether the form's been submitted. Let's just go ahead and test this out so we know that it works. So we'll go ahead, open the browser, hit enter, we've got these two fields, and we can click login and we get the test message. So we now know that everything's working in that sense. We obviously need to go ahead and check that the token is correct and has been supplied as per the form. So we will supply the token using the input helper. Okay, so now we want to go and validate. Again, we don't really need to go over this too much because we've already looked at this functionality, so it doesn't really matter too much. So validation is equal to validate, and we're checking. We're checking. So we have an array of values that we want to check. Simply username, which is going to be an array of sort of defined rules, and the password similarly. Now all we're going to do here is just require both of them, or set both of them to be required. We're not going to do too much else here. We could check lengths and things like that, but for the purpose of this, let's just leave these to both be required. So we need to check if the validation passes. So if validation passed, we need to log user in. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and for each of the errors, so for each validation errors as error, that's a method, so that will need brackets. We're just going to go ahead and echo out the error and append on a break. So a little messy, but it doesn't really matter too much. So in here now, let's go ahead and hit login. Nothing's happening, so let's just double check what's happening. Username and password. Ah yes, of course, we didn't supply the set of data that we want to check against. So when we hit login now, username is required. If I was to type in a username and a password and hit login, this would work now. I've also obviously noticed that the type here needs to be password just to conceal that entry on our form. So now what we actually need to do is log the user in. So we've completed our validation and all the boring things. Now what we want to do is actually log the user in. And we're not going to include the ability to remember the user just yet. We'll go back and retrofit that in a bit later. But the first thing we want to do is instantiate a new user object so we can make use of the methods that we have here. What we're going to do is we're going to process a login by creating a login variable, utilizing the user object and the login method, and passing through input get username and input get password. So we're passing them through. What we then want to do is check if the login was successful and then echo success. So that's all we'll be doing for now, and then we can just do a little investigation and see whether we've actually logged in. I guess otherwise we would echo something like sorry, logging in failed. Just, anything like that, doesn't really matter. So at the moment we obviously don't have the method of the login method available to us, so this will error. So we need to go ahead and build the login method in our user object. So let's go ahead, or user class rather, so let's go and do that. So public function login, we need a username and a password to be passed to this, and let's take a look at what we or have a think about what we need to do. So the first thing we want to do is check whether the username and password has been supplied to this method. So let's go ahead and set these to null by default. So if let's just say we'll do this in sort of what we're basically going to be doing is using this login functionality to a bit later on check whether we haven't supplied a username and a password, and in that case we're going to automatically sign a user in based on the ID that's already been stored in the session. So I guess let's leave this for now and just focus on actually logging the user in. So what we're going to do is we're first of all going to check if the user actually exists or not. But if anything else happens, we're going to return false. We don't really need to, well, in that case our if statement will just be rendered false. So if we create a variable called user and say equals this find username. So by doing that, we've assumed now that we have a method in our class called find, so we need to create this. So we're breaking this up into functionality that we can reuse elsewhere, so we're not sort of tied down to all of the functionality inside of this login. So we obviously need a username passed in here, or user, I'm just going to say null. And the reason we're doing this is saying user is because in this case we're going to say we want to also use this method to find a user by its ID, or their ID rather, not just their username. So what we can do here is just say if user, we're going to say field equals is numeric user. So if this is numeric, we are going to say that we want the field to be ID, otherwise we want the field to be username. Now the only consideration here is, are we allowing users to register with numeric usernames? At the moment we are, so if you want to sort of get around this, you'd have to go back to your validation class and define the ability to only allow, say, alphanumeric usernames or something like that. So in this case, this would fail on users having only numbers for usernames. So that's just something to think about as well. Perhaps a task just to go away and retrofit, change your validation class just to make it a bit more bulletproof. So data is going to represent the data that we get back from the table. So we're going to say this db get, and you probably guessed we're going to get from the users table, and we're going to say where the field, so the field that we've just selected, either ID or username, is equal to user. So what we're now doing is we are grabbing the data from the database, so we can use the methods that we're used to from our database wrapper. So we can say data count. Now what we're going to do is, this will mean that the user does exist, so we are going to return true. We're also going to store the user data, so we need somewhere to do that. So let's create a new property called data, and let's come down here and say this data equals data first. So we're taking the first and only result in this case. So now the data property here will contain all of the user's data. So in this case, what we could then do is check if the user exists. So user, if we print R on user, this will now contain all of the user's information. So when we do when we perform a login now, we should see an array of data. So if I type in Alex and password, click login, 1 we have here. So let's check what's happened. Of course, I think we have no users in our database. Oh no, we do. Okay, let's just take a look here. So we are returning true. This fine. Oh, sorry. Of course, we need to say this data, because this actually returns true rather than actually returning that, and we can pop a return false on that. So yeah. So now what's going to happen is when we refresh, we're printing on the data that's been returned and stored in that property. So we now have all of the data relating to my user account, which is cool, because then we can work with it in here to check passwords and things like that. So now what we're going to do is, back to the actual login function itself, we're going to say if user, because remember we're either returning true or false. So if user, what we're now going to do is check the password. So we need another if statement. We're going to say if this data password. Now hold on a minute, where's this data method come from? Well, it doesn't exist at the moment. The only reason I have decided to do this is because referencing this all the time is going to be a bit of a hassle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and create a private method called data, and that's basically just going to return this data. Lovely. So if this data password equals hash make, remember we already have our hash functionality, password, and remember we pass in a salt as well to this hash method, so hash make string and salt, and that will return us with a hash. So we're basically reversing what we did when we registered a user, and then we're checking the hash against the one that's been generated here too. So we're going to say this data salt, so we're grabbing the salt from the user account as well. Then that basically means that the passwords match. So if we echo, or let's just echo OK. So this isn't going to actually log us in or anything like that, and we'll still get an error here. But if I type in Alex and, I don't know, password 1 login, we get a login failed. We'll get that the next time, but don't let that throw you off. I'm going to type in password now, which is my correct password, and then I get this OK message back because the passwords match. So now that we know that this if statement works for valid passwords, we can go ahead and set a user session. So inside the session class that we've already created, we can use this to set a session and put a session for the user session that we want. Now, because we've stored the session names inside of our initialization file in the config, what we want to do is grab these and store these somewhere useful. So I'm going to say up here in the property list or list of properties, we're going to have a session name here, session name. So inside of construct, what I want to do is I want to say this session name equals config get. if we just take a look at how this is structured so we can remember, so it will be session and session name. So session / session _ name. And yes, so that's it. So we take the session, place it here so we can use it out, throughout our application. Just saves us having to do config get every time we need to do that. It's entirely up to you how this works. So we can now say define the session name, and we then want to put the specific data in, and we're just going to store the user's ID in this case. So we can use the data method now to place the ID in. So now we've actually put the session inside, the ID, user's ID inside of this particular session, and that's it. We've done. We've essentially logged the user in. So what we also might need to do, well, in fact, what we do need to do is return true, because we want to signify that this has been a successful login. So on the login page now, this is going to work better. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a console, and we're going to keep an eye on the local host data here. So basically, if I were to type in Alex and like test or something, click login, this fails. So sorry, logging in failed. If I was to type Alex and password, which is my correct password, and click login, this now says success. So what we've now done is we've successfully logged in. In fact, this won't actually show much, to be honest, but we can go ahead and see how this has worked. We can prove that this has worked. So on index.php, let's go down here, and we're going to say echo session get. Now this is only temporary. Config get session name. So that will echo that out to us. And when I refresh on the index.php page, we see 4, and that is in fact the ID of myself. So we now know that that has been set by the login functionality. Now what happens if we want to check if a user is actually logged in? Well, that's an entirely different story, because what we need to do is in the constructor, every time, when we construct or instantiate a new object, we want to go ahead and check if the session exists and then return whether we're logged in or not. So we'll be looking at that in the next part.